Thank you everyone for joining us on In Focus. I'm Trent Bailey. In studio with me is Matt Morgan. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it.
Matt Morgan is the Democratic candidate for Michigan's 1st Congressional District. Matt, first of all, if you were to be elected, what would be your first priorities once you got to Congress?
Yeah, number one priority for me is to go to the Democratic caucus and push the issue of infrastructure investment. I think it's really key for us. You know, we have a president right now who ran on infrastructure. I think if we can bring him an infrastructure bill, push those things, first of all, the infrastructure we see and deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah.
That is our roads and bridges, as well as our navigable infrastructure on the Great Lakes to include actually budgeting the money to twin the Po Lock, as well as the infrastructure that we can't see, and that's the internet broadband connectivity, being able to get fiber optic, cable extended across the Upper Peninsula, so that we can be providing high-speed internet to those communities, and as well as replacing the water infrastructure, because we have communities here that are they're removing wooden water mains. I mean, that's how old their water infrastructure is. So key investment there is a priority for me.
And that, like the water infrastructure, I think he just signed a bill, but it's not nearly as much as what people wanted. And speaking of infrastructure, the American Society of Civil Engineers graded our nation's infrastructure as a D+. And this was something that he ran on in 2016, and it was something that probably could have had bipartisan support across the board. This is something that everyone kind of gets behind.
True, and the thing that the president did sign the authorization, for the SULOCs, but it's important to remember that that's an authorization for spending. You still got to find the money and put it in the budget, and that's a challenge. That's a real challenge when you look at where we're spending today. The loss of revenue that has resulted in the tax cut, where this huge portion of otherwise the revenue has gone away, and our deficit is now growing. So making these decisions about how we're going to find the money and get it in the budget is one of the most important things we can be doing.
What would you suggest would be a way to find that money is to make up for those tax cuts?
Well, one of the things that we need to be able to do is we need to look at a tax code that's fair. I'm really concerned that this tax bill that was passed is not fair. It's good to be relieving the tax burden off of small businesses. It's really important that we're relieving tax burden on middle class and working families, because they're the ones that drive our economy. They're the ones that buy goods and services, and that's about 2/3 of our overall economy. But when it comes down to it, this tax code's just not equitable, because we've taken, if you're a carpenter, you can no longer deduct the cost of a new pair of boots or jeans or the tires for your truck, whereas a corporate executive can deduct the full cost of the purchase of a new airplane. And so that shows you where some of the inequities are in the tax code. So we really need to fix that so that we can get that revenue, because what this has cost us is it's increased the deficit, and our debt is only mounting ahead of where we thought it was going to be.
And during the Kavanaugh hearings, which took center stage in the national spotlight, the House of Representatives, I believe, voted on or passed like another tax bill, sort of. And I know that President Trump has stated he was looking for a more middle-class tax cut in the future.
Well,
what's the situation with
so
those?
we did see what they did was they made permanent some of the tax cuts that had not been permanent in the previous bill. Those are the types of things that we can support in terms of making sure that we have we're providing tax cuts to those working families, but it didn't address the inequities that are adding to the tax burden overall. And the president's on the campaign trail now talking about another tax cut, but to the best of my knowledge, Congress is not really going to be in session between now and November 6th. So I think that there's a lot of things that are being said right now. Anytime you have a politician in a campaign year, making key promises or taking sole credit for some action, you can really see everything that's wrong with politics today. And we really need to have a new generation of leaders in Congress who are going to remain focused on the things that really matter to their communities and remain loyal to and accountable to their communities.
Something that has passed, not so recently, but in the distant past here now, was the defense spending, which went up a lot. And I know that you were a former Marine for, as you said, over 20 years. How do you feel about the rise in defense spending with those tax cuts in mind, and and other spending on other projects going by the wayside?
Well, anytime you're talking about running the government, anybody who balances the checkbook at home or runs a small business knows that you have to balance your revenue and your spending.
Right.
And so when we look at the spending side, the defense budget's the largest line item in our discretionary budget. And this last bill was just something around $770 billion.
Which was up, I think, 100 million
Or
100.
there were substantial increases, and we're going to continue to see that grow.
Yeah.
There are things there's two pieces of that bill. One is about $700 billion for defense authorization. The other is about $70 billion for what we call overseas contingency operations. And that's, putting gas in the airplanes and the tanks and feeding the troops and, providing for those forces that are already deployed around the world today. That's without any other, engagements, that we would be participating in that weren't already funded. You look at that bill, one of the biggest places where we can find efficiencies is in personnel staff. You look at the combatant commands around the world, their generals have big staffs. There's nothing that generals like more than having a big staff and all these people around them. And, so you have U.S. Central Command, responsible for prosecuting the wars in the Middle East. And underneath it, you have Marine Forces Central, Navy Central, Air Force Central, Army Central. Each of those generals has big staffs. And each way you go down the chain, these really large staffs are existing, to plan and to support the troops in the field, but there are massive efficiencies that can be gained there. And that's one of the areas where we should be targeting to really draw down and reduce the cost, because nothing costs more than personnel. And so we want to make sure our troops downrange have the bullets they need, have the medical support that they need, that they have quality food and nutrition, that they have the gas and everything they need to accomplish the mission. But when we look at kind of some of the bloated bureaucracy, the Pentagon is one of the worst agencies in that regard.
Yeah, and you always hear reports of coming out of the defense spending is major contracts for corporations that are not really providing us with stuff that we use as much anymore or is not needed. Is there some fat that can be trimmed there?
There's certainly opportunities to gain efficiencies there. But I worked in the Pentagon. I've worked at a major command. I've seen how bloated staffs can get, not just in uniformed personnel, but in contract personnel. National security is important. And we need to make sure we're fully funding national security, we're prosecuting the wars that we need to keep America safe. But there's no question that if we're smart about it, I had an opportunity last night, I sat on a panel with a retired 3-star Coast Guard Admiral and a retired Marine Corps 3-star Admiral, both of whom have endorsed my candidacy. And in large part because they know that I'm going to remain focused on doing just this, being able to talk intelligently and work hard within Congress and with the Pentagon to be able to find those efficiencies so that we can do things like finally budget the money to twin the POLOC.
So going back to infrastructure, do you think, what kind of system would you think would be best put in place to improve our infrastructure? Is it going to be more like public-private partnerships, or was there any changes in that you would want to see?
There's certainly a place for public-private partnerships. I mean, it's how a lot of infrastructure gets done. But we shouldn't be focusing entirely on, enabling for-profit motives, right? When you're saying, well, we want to do this so that they can, have this company make more money. We don't want to turn our highways into toll roads. In Michigan's 1st Congressional District, we have about 120 miles of interstate. That's it.
Yeah.
25,000 square miles and only about 120 miles of interstate.
Yeah.
And that's between Grayling and the Sioux, right? But we really are relying on our U.S. highways and our Michigan state highways, and we really need to be able to work to provide funding for that. And there's absolutely a place for public-private ventures there. When we get into things like major highways and interstates, I'm concerned that we're going to turn them into toll roads. And what you're going to have is, people will probably spend money to drive I-94 between Chicago and Detroit. But how much are they willing to pay to drive north of Bay City, on I-75, and how's that going to work? So we should be always concerned about, protecting against the for-profit motive when we look at investing in that infrastructure.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think like Copper Harbor is the furthest place in the continental U.S. to an interstate, and I think that's from there all the way over to the Sioux or over to Wisconsin.
Anecdotally, that sounds right. You
Yeah.
know, I talked to your state rep, Scott Dianda,
Mm-hmm.
and Scott frequently talks about the fact that when he's in Calumet, he's closer to 3 other state capitals and 1 provincial capital than he is to Lansing.
Yeah.
You know, so it's really important actually that we think about that when we're talking about infrastructure overall, and that you have a representative who's really present in the district and is willing to fight for your district. And that's, you know, like Scott and I work together well, and of course supporting him for the state Senate seat, because, you know, he's going to remain focused on making sure folks in Lansing don't forget about the fact that you've got, you know, 15 counties here north of the bridge, and I'm going to be a good partner to him in Washington to help making sure that we're continuing to invest here as well.
And you just said, mentioned the broadband and the internet, and they just approved the tunnel for Line 5 underneath the Straits of Mackinac. Do you think that there would be federal funding that could help bring broadband through that tunnel and across the Upper Peninsula?
Well, when it comes to broadband expansion, I think that the best way to do it is to let the public utilities to provide means for them, to funding streams for them to be able to invest in deploying fiber optic cable, gigafiber, you know, high quality, high speed fiber, so that when, say, UPCO is taking their electric lines and they're burying them along a right of way, they can deploy fiber optic cable in the process of doing that. What that allows us the opportunity to do is then UPCO could lease the fiber optic cable to the internet service providers. And so that rather than just having one internet service provider locally that doesn't even offer broadband connectivity, now you could have competition and actual high-speed broadband. And so that is the best way I think we do it, is that the federal government provides a means, perhaps a rotating loan program for the utilities like UPCO, consumers, DTE, to be able to get in that business of deploying fiber optic cable. And, you know, it's a benefit not only in terms of expanding broadband, but now when you've got a construction project and they're digging along the highway, they don't have to come back and dig again. It's you dig once, put it all in.
2 birds with 1 stone kind
exactly,
of thing. Yeah.
for sure.
All right, I'm going to switch it up here a little bit, and healthcare is a giant topic, especially in this election cycle. What do you think should be our federal healthcare system moving forward?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're going to have to address healthcare, and we're going to have to do it in a bipartisan way. We're not going to be able to have one house do what they did in 2009, 2010, when they pushed through the Affordable Care Act on a completely partisan, single-party vote. And what they did when they did that was they created weaknesses in the Affordable Care Act. They didn't address drug prices. They didn't address, you know, insurers' key roles. They didn't leave in the potential for a public option. I mean, those weaknesses really helped to create a circumstance whereas opponents of the Affordable Care Act were able to beat away at the foundation and weaken it over time.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons,
which has happened.
It's exactly what has happened. So now we have people paying higher and higher premiums because they don't have competition in their market. We've got individuals who are not able to get health insurance because the administration has now violated essentially a key principle of the Affordable Care Act by allowing states, by granting waivers for states to have insurance plans that don't cover pre-existing conditions.
Right.
And so that's a critical issue. So we have to address this as a country. We've got to do it in a bipartisan way. I don't think that there's some plans that I would consider more on the far left that are a single-payer approach. I don't necessarily believe...
Like a Medicare for all.
Well, you know, and I think that when we get into talking about it and we label different
Yeah.
things, people hear different things.
Right.
When you hear single-payer, some people hear socialized medicine, and that's not a direction in where we want to go.
Right.
What we do want to do is create expanded opportunity so that people have access to health care. I think that Medicare expansion would be the most effective way to do that. It could be done over time, but there are costs associated with that. And we have to be realistic about what we're able to do and how quickly. And again, that's why it would all be about a bipartisan solution, because it's probably going to take 5 to 7 years at least to implement a plan like that. And so you want to make sure that you're not just got one party pushing their thing and not working in a bipartisan fashion to develop a plan that really works for all Americans.
So do you think when you go up to the drawing board, would you want to see the Affordable Care Act fixed and tinkered with and here and there where it needs help, and hopefully you can get bipartisan support on that? Or are you starting...
I think probably you start with where we're at, because you have a lot of Americans. For example, here in Michigan's 1st Congressional District, there are 46,000 people who have health coverage that didn't have it before the Affordable Care Act was enacted. Governor Snyder participated in the Medicare expansion program. Gretchen Whitmer, I know, worked very closely with him. Again, a great example of bipartisanship working together to make sure that you're expanding coverage for really hundreds of thousands of Michiganders overall. So that's a good thing, that we were able to expand that kind of health coverage. I wouldn't want to see that go away, particularly when it comes to Medicaid overall. 2 out of every 3 seniors in this district that is living in long-term care is being covered by Medicaid. And so if we attack Medicaid, if we defund it or cut it, then you're going to have to clean out that back bedroom because mom's coming home.
Right.
And that would be an extreme hardship for so many families. So that's one of the reasons why I say the Affordable Care Act. Let's protect the things that we've done to help families. But let's address the things that we've come up short on. One of those is drug prices. That wasn't addressed in the Affordable Care Act the way it should have been. So even if you're covered under Medicare and you got Medicare Part D, the drug benefit, you could still end up paying a $1,000 copay. I talked to a woman the other day who she got a phone call from her pharmacist and said, "Hey, I've got your 90-day supply of your heart medicine here ready for you. I just want to let you know that the copay is $998. And if you're trying to get by on Social Security and your medical care is covered under Medicare, a $1,000 bill every 3 months is not something that's easy for you to come up with. And so you're going to have that senior who's making difficult decisions about paying rent or buying what they're buying for groceries, how much that cart gets filled up when they go to shop the next time.
And I can't remember the exact figures on this. I think Michigan's 1st district here is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the expanded Medicare and the Affordable Care Act.
Absolutely.
And stuff, right? Yeah,
absolutely. So 46,000 in the district, and that's a big number. Families that have health care now that didn't have any coverage before, and that's important. And another point, bring up, you talk about Michigan's 1st Congressional District and how we're unique. There are 208,000 Social Security beneficiaries here in this district. Large portion of those are retirement age beneficiaries. That's about 22% of our population, so almost 1 in 4.
Yeah.
That's significantly higher than any other state in the country, which is the most other states, I should say, in the country, which are at about 14.5%. So we tend to have an older population. It's more reliant on Social Security here. The good news is that when Social Security is fully funded, those individuals are putting $3.2 billion back into our local economy,
right?
Because they're buying goods and services with the Social Security monies that they receive. But we absolutely have to fight to protect Social Security. It's a key issue because we talked about the tax issue earlier. Well, we've blown a gaping hole in our deficit, and if they want to come back and say, well, because of this now we've got to
Mitch McConnell last week said Medicare and Social Security is a big problem with the reason why we're having a deficit now.
Right, and I talk to seniors about this frequently, and they are concerned. We have to fight to protect Social Security. One of the ways that we can do that, people talk about solvency. There's not enough there. Well, we're funded, well into the next decade. And one of the things that we could do to solve the solvency issue is the FICA tax that you pay on your paycheck. A lot of people don't realize that you don't pay FICA on income over around $132,000. So if you are out there and your family's making $60,000 a year, you're paying your FICA tax on that's the tax, of course, that provides for Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security.
Right.
And you're paying that tax on every dime of that $60,000. But if someone over here is making $250,000 in salary, then they're only paying that FICA on the first $132,000. And so I say, we open it up. You make $250,000, you should pay the FICA on every dime of that $250,000. I mean, that's fairness. And what it will do is it will make secure Social Security for not just this generation of seniors, but future generations.
And President Trump, one of the things that he ran on was not touching those benefits, so what do you think now that?
Well, I would say I agree with the president.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that we protect those benefits, and it's gonna mean coming in. This next Congress is gonna have to make some really hard decisions, and making those hard decisions means working together, and working together means we have to get rid of the bitter partisan tone we have in Washington today. I mean, unfortunately, we're seeing the real life ramifications of this kind of tone and vilifying the other side. We need to get back to a time, when we had leaders like, John McCain, who could work across the aisle with, Vice President, then Senator Biden, and you see that real bipartisanship. I had the opportunity when I served in Iraq in 2007. We had a congressional delegation come through. Included, John McCain and Claire McCaskill and John Warner and Carl Levin, who then was the chair of the committee. And to see them work together, to respect one another as colleagues, is something that I think we really, Americans long for. We want to see that day come back, and I'm committed to going to Washington and bringing that tone of bipartisanship back, because if you're standing on the steps of the Capitol calling the other guy's name, the other guys' names, then you're going to be, it's not going to be as easy to work together in the committee room.
Right. And it's interesting that you brought that up. I've talked to a few people that are on the campaign trail right now, and even though the national political atmosphere is, like you said, pretty torn right down the middle and people are calling names and pointing fingers about everything, how has that affected you on your campaign trail so far? Well,
one of the things that, as the Democratic candidate, that frustrates me is I think our national party leadership is out of touch with Americans in districts like Michigan 1, especially these rural areas here. I just don't think they know how to connect with these voters, and they've lost touch. And I would say the same thing is probably can be, the same criticism can be levied at some of the leaders on the other side. We need to move away from it. We need new leaders who are willing to go to Washington and tell people like Nancy Pelosi that you're not doing what you need to be doing to bring these sides together. When the Republicans bring forward a health care bill and you refuse to go into committee with them, that's a problem. You're not doing your job, and you need to be able to work together. And I'm committed to doing it because that's the only way we're going to make real change.
Yeah, it seems like both parties kind of have dug their heels in now and are not budging on really anything.
I think everyone here and at home can agree that in order to help Michigan, we have to fix Washington, and fixing Washington begins by working together. I've committed to working, in terms of how we relate to every single person in this district. I've gotten out and talked to voters. It's not Democrat or Republican. It's you here in Ontonagon County. What are your challenges? When you go over to the Sioux, what are your biggest concerns? And they're tired. They're tired of this era part of certain politics. I talk to voters who are not even sure if they want to vote anymore because they just don't think it's going to make a difference. And I promise them, you got to get out and vote. If you want to see change, you get to the voting booth, and you'll see change when you send a new generation of leaders to Washington.
And is this part of the reason why you chose to run? I know you obviously served for a long time in the Marine Corps, and then you were into the private sector for a while.
Yeah, I worked as an independent contractor for a while. I never really had any political aspirations, but in 2016, I went into the voting booth. My wife went in the voting booth. Our friends and neighbors and the people we go to church with, we all talk about this stuff. And you go to the voting booth in November 16, and we didn't feel like we had a lot of choices. I wasn't excited about voting. I went out and did my duty. But I didn't feel like we had good candidates for president, and particularly at the congressional level, I was concerned because neither of the candidates, Democrat or Republican, really had any true roots in the district. I mean, in terms of they weren't raising family here. They weren't business owners here.
That was the biggest storyline for the first district in the last election was
carpetbagger versus carpetbagger.
Both of them were saying they weren't from here. So
well, and I'll tell you this: I'll readily admit I am not a Youper. I am not from Michigan. I'm also not foolish enough to pretend like I am. And Youpers can sniff out a rat pretty easily. And I tell you, for us, I mean, I married a Youper. It's as close as I could get. And we got back here as soon as we could. More than 20 years on active duty in the Marine Corps. We moved constantly. We've been here now for over 5 years, which is longer than I've lived anywhere since I was 17 years old, so this is home for us. I'm raising kids here. I got a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old in school down in the Traverse City area. My wife's a business owner. She's her office set up here in the district. She owns a small business, pass-through type business, a business that's doing well as a consequence of these tax cuts. But she's also not hiring more people as a consequence of it. So you always got to look at those details when you're looking at it. But I think it's really important to have someone that you can relate to, someone who's committed to the district, someone who's doing it for the right reasons. I'll tell you, I put my trust in the congressman as elected, but I was immediately disappointed because I saw him treat constituents with outright contempt. And when you're representing a district as big and relatively diverse in terms of communities as Michigan one, from Ironwood to the Sioux, or from St. Ignace down to Traverse City, you see a lot of different types of little local economies, and you're always going to have people that are not happy with you about something. And your job as a congressman is to stand up there, explain your vote, let people express their displeasure, but to reflect back on them. The idea that you are above their criticism, to me, that's not leadership. Leadership is about serving the people that you're there to represent. And so that means sometimes you're going to have to humble yourself, and take it. Because once I'm elected, there will be votes I take that people disagree with, and they're going to have the opportunity to express that, and I will give them every opportunity to do it.
So that combined with the atmosphere in general is what drove you to get into the public sector?
It did. What we really thought was, we need to find somebody who reflects the values of this district. We need to find somebody who's raising kids here. Somebody who has a history of service to the country, who is a good fit. People in northern Michigan, the UP, they respect veterans. 1 in 10 voters in this district is a veteran. Veterans issues are really important, so to have some credibility there is important. And so we went out and we kind of tried to find somebody that fit that mold. And it wasn't too long into it that a colleague of mine said, have you ever thought about doing this? And once the question was put to me, my wife Angie and I sat down and talked about it. And I just kind of came to the same conclusion that I would come to, in terms of a leader when I was an infantry officer, is I can't expect anyone else to do something I'm not willing to do myself. And so we said, we're going to do this. We're going to take the step forward. I won't make any light of this. It is a difficult thing to do. It's a 25,000 square mile district. We're on the road a lot. Means that you don't get to see the kids as much as you want to, or you don't get to sleep in your own bed as frequently as you'd like. But the reality is that this is such an important undertaking. It's so important that people have representation in Washington, people who are willing to do the work, be out there, meet with voters, talk to people about their needs. And I'll tell you, we were just talking with Congressman Bart Stupak recently, and I told him, you run for Congress in Michigan 1, it doesn't take but a few minutes before you're being compared to Bart Stupak. And what people frequently tell me is that they will say, I didn't agree with Bart on everything, but, and everybody's got a but, because he returned my phone call when I called his office. He showed up when I needed help doing this. And that's the type of model, that's the type of role model that I'm looking to, in terms of how you effectively represent Michigan 1.
And it's obviously, you mentioned it before, it's a giant district, especially compared to there are some ones downstate that are relatively small. What are the challenges for campaigning in this?
Well, it's interesting. I was talking to Andy Levin, who was running to replace his father downstate, and we were laughing because he complains when he's got a 45-minute drive to get home. There's a lot of those districts you can run across without breaking a sweat. So, we really look at this district from the perspective of trying to continue to circulate. That's you keep moving, and that's the key. From where my house is in Traverse City, I can get pretty much everywhere in the district. I can get across to Alpena, or even up to the eastern UP to the Sioux in an hour, 2.5 hours. Right. But then when you head west in the UP, you just commit to being there for a while. And so we split our time to make sure that once we go north and head west from St. Ignace, that we're going to be in the district, and that's what we're doing right now. I mean, we're here in Ishpeming, and we started the morning in Marquette. Last night we were down in Traverse City. Today we'll end in the Sioux. We'll go through Escanaba for an event and end in the Sioux, do some stuff there tomorrow, and then head back down to the lower. And you just keep circulating. You make sure you have your MAC card ready to go. So you can avoid the lines, and that's the way you do it. You just stay in the road. As a matter of fact, I would say that when I was an infantry officer, we had an expression. It was called walking the lines. And that expression is you know, a representation of the philosophy that you need to get out and, you know, walk the terrain. You need to, you know, see where your machine guns are, make sure there aren't any gaps in your coverage, you know where your claymores are, and you look at your fighting positions, but you also get the opportunity then to talk to your individual Marines and sailors. You know, when you sit in a fighting hole with a Marine, and it's cold and wet and you're sharing a cup of coffee, you really get to know them, and they tell you things that they might not have otherwise told you. So we applied that same philosophy to running for office here. It'd be the same philosophy that I would apply to representing the district. As you get out, you walk the lines, you make sure you have the opportunity to sit down with people and understand the challenges that they face on a daily basis.
And we've brought up your military background a few times. What part of being an officer in the Marines do you think is going to directly affect being a public servant if you are elected the most?
You know, when you're a Marine officer, when you're a Marine leader overall, you practice leadership on a daily basis. You know, you learn what good leadership looks like, but you're always practicing, you're always working to improve your leadership abilities. You seek that self-improvement. One of our principles is to know yourself and seek self-improvement, right? And so we take that on in our approach to leadership, and it's really a service-based approach. The notion that you serve the people you lead. In fact, we put a fine point on it with an expression that says that if service is beneath you, then leadership is beyond you. You know, you need to learn how to serve first if you want to lead. That's really the approach that I'm taking to this as well. I think it's something that we see too little of in Washington today. You know, they go to Washington, they forget about the people they're supposed to represent, and really one of the biggest factors in that is money in politics today. It's been a major corrupting influence since the passage, you know, since the judgment in Citizens United, and it's one of the reasons why we made the very difficult decision at the beginning of this campaign to refuse corporate money. You know, we only take money from individuals and member organizations that are member supported, like, you know, Michigan Education Association. So, you know, these are teachers that give nickels from their paychecks, and you know, so we're able to support and run a viable campaign by doing that. And what it means is that when I go to Washington, I'm not going to owe anybody but the people that I was elected to represent.
Right. If you were elected, is that something you would try to change or pass legislation on, is money in politics, and try to reform some of the campaign finance rules?
I think that's absolutely critical that we come up with a solution, and it's going to be difficult. And I don't. There's no illusion.
Yeah, no politician is going to say no. Don't give me the money.
Well, and it's you know, there's a reason why we talk about for healthcare, for example.
Yeah.
There's a reason why it's so difficult to fix, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's about 15 pharmaceutical lobbyists on Capitol Hill for every one congressional member. That type of influence, that type of lobbying, where money is power, is one of the things that stands in the way of making real change for folks like, you know, people who live in the UP, and that's why we're so committed to not taking that corporate money, because that way you'll know that my interests are aligned with the values and the priorities of the people of Michigan.
Right. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. On your website, one of the things that you lead off with and what you want to do is ensure that there's secure jobs with good wages for working families in the district. What would you want to do right away when you get there to try to help that? Because this district has lost a lot when it comes to income and wages, especially this area with the mine closing down, and there are other things that have been closing down across the district. What would you want to do to change that?
One of the biggest things that we can do from a federal level is to help communities close the skills gap. You know, that is making sure that young people are developing the skills that they need to qualify for good paying jobs. The career tech education programs in public schools are certainly one way to do that. And I think that, you know, a better system of federal investment in education is the direction that we would want to pursue. One of the committees that I would seek to sit on would be the education and the workforce. So because those two things are inextricably linked. Right. So to make sure that you have the qualified workforce, and when we want to grow our local communities, we want to preserve local economies. One of the critical things we need, in addition to internet broadband and affordable power, is a locally trained, skilled workforce. And that means we have to have these programs available in our public schools. So I'd be seeking ways in which we can improve our investment in career tech education programs. Right now, those are locally sustained, primarily through millages, that go to the intermediate school districts. And that really relies heavily on the property tax base. How much property, how much taxpayers are there, how many taxpayers are there in your county, and what's the property value there. And so that can wildly vary from intermediate school district to intermediate school district, depending on their locality. So I think that finding a better means of investment and moving beyond grants. Right now, the bill that just passed, the House is heavily reliant on grants. And what that does is that actually puts rural school districts at a disadvantage. Because really it's the mid-size and larger districts that have the staff and the capacity to write grants.
Is it because it's like a per pupil thing, or why is it so much of a disadvantage?
Well, because you have to write the grant requests, and sometimes they're lengthy.
Okay.
Sometimes they're detailed. You have to compete for that money. You don't necessarily know if the money is going to be there, and if you are programming, that is, you're laying out a budget for supporting a career tech program. You need a reliable source of revenue, and grants are not that. Grants can be really great to helping buoy a new project, jumpstart something, but really a reliable stream of funding to support the capital investment for those programs is key, and that's something that I'd be looking to support in Congress.
And education is another thing that's on your website as one of your top priorities, and you just mentioned it a few times there. Other than changing the way that the funding works from a federal level, what would you want to see change with the education system?
One of the things that the federal government right now takes a very proscriptive approach to education. They say, this is what you have to teach. These are the standards you have to meet. If you don't meet these standards, then we're gonna punish you. I don't think that's the right approach at all.
So you think it should go back to more of a block funding?
Well, right now the federal government actually invests very little in public education. I think that in Michigan it's something like 4 to 6% of all your education funding comes from the feds, and usually those are programs through like Head Start. What I would be looking for is, the opportunity to say, let's look at where education is working. Let's look at school districts that are making this work for their community and find ways to help foster that elsewhere, rather than kind of a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. Yeah, I have friends that are teachers or former teachers, and they kind of hate that it's almost a cookie cutter system across I guess the nation for those sorts of funding programs. Right. So do you think that the federal government should just stop doing I think it's like the Common Core system where everyone has to do certain things in order to get the funding, or do you think there's a way that you could work those in while also helping in other areas? Yeah,
I think that there's ways that you can help influence or buoy up school systems that are struggling. And many of the times, the reasons that they're struggling is because the population that they serve is struggling. Good example of this is in Michigan's 1st Congressional District, 1 in 5 kids goes to bed hungry. And if you're hungry, you can't learn as well. And you get in some counties, and there's at least one county here in the UP where that number is 1 in 3 kids. And so it's no surprise that the school districts there are also struggling. I've talked to one superintendent that told me directly, he's like, if you show me a school that has high enrollment for free and reduced lunch, he's like, I'll show you a school that was slumping test scores, because those things are so closely connected. So realistically, we have to look at a full approach. We need to make sure that our kids are fed so that they can learn. We need to make sure that our teachers are paid a good wage so that they come to work every day prepared. And we need to make sure that if a teacher digs into his own pocket to buy school supplies, then that's a tax-deductible business expense.
Yeah, you can write that off. Yeah.
Because if you've got an executive who's able to write off the cost of a corporate jet, you sure as a teacher ought to be able to write off the cost of a box of pencils. And so those are some of the concerns when you look big picture-wise that we should be addressing. And there's the role for the federal government, again, not to be prescriptive, not to say you must do this, you must do that, but to really come in and say, where can we help? You know, if you want to, you know, those constitutional responsibilities of provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare,
Right.
you know, that's really the federal government's role to help there rather than to be prescriptive and directive about how to do it. Because one size doesn't fit all. We know that a school district in Copper Country is not the same as a school district in Grand Rapids.
And within the Democratic Party, at least in the last few years, when it comes to education, someone always brings up free college tuition or community colleges. Is there something with the higher learning, whether it be trade school, community college, four-year state universities, is there something that you think the federal government should be doing better at funding for these things to reduce the loans? Because I know the student loan debt in America right now is skyrocketing. What would you think the federal government should be doing or doing different?
There's two pieces of this here. One is we talk about community colleges and really what I consider 13th and 14th year programs. You know, you look at public school and you want to be able to provide pathways to kids. And so investing in career tech programs for the intermediate school districts, creating that linkage through Michigan community colleges, making sure that, you know, if you're in a program in 11th and 12th grade that maybe you're earning credits, you know, toward that 13th and 14th year already, so you're providing a step forward. Grants are still helpful there for students, but students have to know about them. They have to be able to apply for them. I think that if we can work more closely with the building trades and skilled labor in conjunction with those schools and, you know, local community employers that know their needs to be able to shape programs. So that's really the kind of community engagement there. The federal government role would be, as I mentioned earlier in the career tech, you know, concept, is to provide for capital investment so that if Gogebic Community College wants to start a robotics program, there's a funding revenue, there's a funding stream available to them to be able to do the initial investment to start that program. In terms of four-year educations, there's no question that we need to be working with the states primarily to help them get the costs down. I think you know, my friend Paul Brown, who's running for the U of M Board of Regents, grew up on the east end of the UP here. He said that the tuition at Michigan, University of Michigan, has gone up 600% in the last decade. That type of cost is not something we need to be looking to students to bear or to incur debt in order to do that. That's not to say I'm directly a proponent of so-called free college. We all know nothing's free. So we have to look at how we, you know, ease some of that burden off the student without passing it directly to the institution. And I think there are ways to do that. If we can be innovative. I'll give you an example. I had free college.
Right.
You know, I went to a four-year university. I paid no tuition. I paid no fees. My books were provided to me. And I even got $100 a month in a stipend, you know, to help with rent and food. But, you know, that was the United States Navy who was picking up the tab for me.
Yeah.
And when I got out and I graduated, I didn't pay them back in dollars. I pay them back through service. And I'm not suggesting that everyone join ROTC.
Yeah, like a conscription thing.
No, not at all.
That.
Not at
Okay.
all. But I'm just saying that there's a way. If we look at that as a model, then we could look at, you know, in many of these areas here, like Newberry, for example. Newberry has trouble attracting doctors and nurse practitioners, right, to come to the rural UP. People love the way of life. They love the opportunity. But, you know, if they've got debt from medical school, you know, they want to go someplace like Chicago, Cincinnati, Detroit, where
pay off
they
those
can
loans
earn
quicker,
more, right,
yeah.
quicker and pay more. You know, we look at our public health service, and I think that there's an opportunity there where you could take a student who wants to serve, you know, who wants to be involved in rural medicine, and be able to send them to school free of, you know, at no cost to the medical student, but with an opportunity to pay that back through service in a rural community at a rural hospital.
And I think there has been discussions in the past of this sort of idea with like teachers as well, I believe, where there was an idea.
Yeah, I mean, we could do that with teachers. We could do it with any number. We could, you know, look at agriculture. You know, Department of Agriculture and some of the initiatives that we do overseas. You know, you provide opportunities for kids to go to MSU, major in something in agriculture, and then, you know, go to work for USDA. I mean, as long as we're innovative and thoughtful about how we want to do it, and that helps us to make sure that we're graduating the students that we need to fill the gaps in the workforce.
in those situations, is there anything in place right now that, I know you said something about the USDA, MSU, but is
There
there
are a few,
programs?
but
yeah.
it's not, I don't believe, it's not there. It's not as pervasive, as it could be if we were thoughtful about how we want to approach it. I mean, the U.S. State Department has trouble filling foreign service jobs. Basically an ROTC for foreign service officers.
Right.
There's a lot of needs that we have in America today, and I think that in terms of you have the Department of Education that is interested in pursuing this type of innovation instead of enabling for-profit schools. I mean, that's really one of the entire focuses of this Department of Education under Secretary DeVos is expanding, for-profit schools. And we mentioned student loan debt. That's one of the biggest factors in student loan debt today is students who pursue a degree through a for-profit school, they pick up bad debt, they don't get their degree because these schools have really low degree completion rates.
Right.
And now, not only do they have debt, but they can't go get the job they need to pay it off. And so we need to stop this for-profit education system that we have and stop creating opportunities for bad debt.
And switching gears again, big in the news right now is the caravan that's making its way towards our southern border that's of immigrants coming from South and Central America. How do you feel this should be treated if they get to the border, and what do you think should be done with the border as a whole?
John Kelly, now the White House Chief of Staff, at the time as he was being confirmed as the Secretary of Homeland Security, told senators in the confirmation process that real border security begins 1,500 miles south of the border. Our security partnership, security cooperation with our neighbors, particularly to the south, is a really important thing for us. We need to have a strong relationship with Mexico. When I was at Marine Corps Forces Command, one of our responsibilities was in working with the Mexican government, helping to train Mexican Marines who do have a lot of law enforcement down there. But having those relationships in place is key. What we are seeing today in Central America is the product of decades of corruption in those areas, and now we have people fleeing gang violence, and this type of migration is going to be an issue. It's going to continue to be a problem, and it's not just from Mexico. We're going to see it more from Africa, as things like global warming contribute to food and water scarcity. So we want to make sure that we're looking at these issues, way down the road. Now, in terms of our border security, I've worked at the Pentagon. I'm a U.S. Marine. I absolutely know we need strong borders. The idea that anyone supports open borders is just absurd. It's not something we can manage.
Right.
Not good for America, not right for America right now. We need border security. We have to be smart in how we do it. And again, I think managing those relationships with our allies and our nearest neighbors, and then being smart in terms of border security and leveraging technology. A wall doesn't have to be a physical wall. A physical wall necessarily isn't even the most effective thing you can use. So making sure we're looking at surveillance and sensors and monitoring as part of that security mix. I mean, we've had a wall in Tijuana, in San Ysidro for a long time, and we still have people coming around.
That's what a lot of people don't realize, that there are parts of the border that already have walls that they get over or under.
Yeah. So. The big picture thing, though, when it comes to immigration is simple, I think, in terms of, what Americans don't like is line cutters. And, you learn that in kindergarten, right? You don't cut the line. And I think that what we need is really strong immigration reform so we can create a line. And if you are here illegally, then you should be given the opportunity to get in that line, but you go to the back of the line. You don't get to cut. You get to cut ahead of somebody who's done it right, somebody who's filled out their application process. And then we need to look at, in terms of our immigration system, who do we want to welcome to America, and how do we do it? I mentioned the shortage of doctors in rural districts. We need immigration to provide doctors in those districts. We need engineers who might, for example, be Chinese who have gone to school in the United States, paid tuition to go to school in the United States.
Right.
That has helped the University of Michigan by, that's net money coming into Michigan from China. That's a good thing. But those individuals then want to go to work for an American company. We need to have a visa process that respects that as well, but also provides for our security. And I think that we can do it. We don't need to politicize this. Everybody believes that we need immigration reform. There's a few disagreements on the details of it, but let's agree on the fundamental principles here, that we need comprehensive immigration reform. We need a line. We need rules for that line. And we need it because our economy needs immigration to work.
And I believe in the majority of cases of people that are here illegally, a lot of times they fly in and their visa expires and they're still in the country, and that's a little bit harder to track than the people that are trying to.
About 60%, I think, today of undocumented immigrants in America are visa overstays.
Yeah.
So, when we look at the issue that we're dealing with there, we do have, for example, there's two major programs that provide for seasonal workers right here in Michigan. The H-2A, which is an agriculture visa, and the H-2B, which is a short-term workers, temporary worker visa for folks in the hospitality service, folks that work in the hotels on Mackinac Island. And I often hear that, well, short-term worker visas aren't an immigration issue. Well, they most certainly are, because they're contributing to our undocumented population here in the United States. We need a system where, having seasonal workers is good, but we need to be able to manage that when we're bringing people in and they're going back home or not. So, because things happen. I mean, you come here, you're on a seasonal worker permit, you fall in love, you become a parent, your child is a resident, is a citizen, and so we need that to be part of our system.
So you support a good reform for a path to citizenship for these illegal immigrants that are here right now?
I think that's a loaded expression.
Yeah.
Okay, when we talk, I like to think in terms of getting in line.
Yeah.
And if there are rules about that line that say you got to go back here, you got to go there, and you got to reapply, then I think that needs to be part of our conversation. But the whole thing's been politicized to the point that we know we can do better. And I look to Republican President George W. Bush, who was pressing this issue. It was one of his principal priorities back in 2004, and we had the opportunity there to make some change, and we didn't get that done.
Obama did the same thing early on, I believe even when he was a senator, when Bush was president, said about we have to have these strong borders, and it just seems like every time it comes up, nothing really gets done.
Yep,
at
and
the
you get,
federal level.
the truth is this goes back to how kind of the way we started the conversation, which is when you have extreme elements of either party holding the middle hostage, and in the middle is where the votes exist to get things done, you've got a broken Washington. And so, if we're going to help Michigan, we got to fix Washington, and it begins there.
And kind of on the same subject, but a little bit different, a lot of what we're seeing at the southern border right now are people seeking asylum. How do you think the federal government should be treating those people differently than how they have so far?
Well, when someone's seeking asylum, there's international law regarding refugees, and we need to work in conjunction with that international law. We need to do at least as well as we would expect anyone in Europe or Africa to do. And so we need to have a process. And that goes back to that reform process of creating a line, creating a system so that if people are in fact seeking asylum, and there are people who legitimately have been forced to leave their homes because of gang violence and threats and that type of thing. And so we need to be able to create the opportunity for asylum so that they don't turn into undocumented immigrants.
Right. As far as education, is there any other system that you think should work better or could work better?
Well, I look at it this way. I've talked about the federal government not being so parochial about the way that they approach this, and I think that if you use a venture capital model instead, that is, venture capital is out there looking for opportunities, people who've created something that works, that they want to invest in, that they can then take to market. So I think if the federal government took the same approach. So, for example, if I go up to Copper Country ISD and I have a conversation with someone there, we see something that's working, then we need to figure out, well, how do we make that work elsewhere? And if it's through investment, federal investment, then we create the mechanisms to do it.
All right, I appreciate you coming in.
Thank you very
having a
much.
great conversation.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for watching In Focus. I'm Trent Bailey. Have a good one.